Hey, Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. Welcome back. The history of race relations in our country have been much in the front pages throughout almost all of 2020, from the death of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd and many others, to the protests out in the streets for social justice, and the debates going on about the Confederate monuments in our country and where they came from, what they mean, and what should be done with them. For many people, all of the things that I just described reminded them of the most racially motivated murder of the 20th century, if not in American history. I'm talking about the murder of Emmett Till, which happened 65 years ago this week on August 28th, 1955. I want to tell you that story has a lot of moving parts and pieces, and I also want to warn you there are some very graphic images in this video. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old African-American male who lived in Chicago with his mother, Mamie Till. And Mamie Till's family was from the Mississippi Delta. They often received family from the Mississippi Delta in Chicago, and they went back to visit from time to time. And that summer in 1955, Emmett made his fourth trip back to Mississippi to visit relatives there in the heart of cotton-growing country. Now, in 1955, in Mississippi, the laws, written and unwritten, of Jim Crow America were in full force. White people walking on the sidewalk, black people had to give way. You didn't look a white person in the eye if you were black. You never disputed them. You never sassed them. You never acted disrespectful. You never acted fresh if you were a black male toward a white woman in any way that she would perceive it as acting fresh. Emmett Till knew all of this before his visit to Mississippi that summer. His mother had drilled it into him that if necessary he would get down on his knees in deference to white people. Mississippi, she said, is not Chicago. Be careful and be on your manners at all times. One afternoon during his visit, Emmett and some of his cousins and friends visited a nearby grocery store that catered to the black community there near Money, Mississippi, a small town in the Delta. Grocery store that was owned by Carolyn and Roy Bryant, a white couple. What happened in that grocery store on that day has been in dispute for 65 years. No one knows exactly. But Emmett Till was later accused of, in one way or another, violating one of the unwritten rules of Jim Crow America. Carolyn Bryant accused him of either whistling or otherwise acting fresh toward her. No one knows exactly what happened, but when Emmett Till came out of that store, his cousins hustled him away from there and hoped that the whole thing would die down. It didn't. In small-town Mississippi, it only got bigger with the retelling. By the time Roy Bryant returned from an out-of-town trip, his wife told him about it. He was enraged, determined to have vengeance. Said later he couldn't face the white community if he let a black kid from Mississippi or from Chicago get away talking to his wife in a way that she thought was fresh. He enlisted the aid of his half-brother, J.W. Milam, and in the dark of night, the early morning hours of the 28th of August, a Sunday morning, they went in search of Emmett Till and found him at the cabin, the sharecropping cabin, of Mose Wright, Emmett Till's great-uncle, 64 years old. These two men appeared at the door with a flashlight and a pistol and demanded, as Mose Wright later recounted, that they wanted that boy that had done all that talking, they said. They took him from the house, and his family never saw him again. Now, over the next several hours, Emmett Till was viciously, savagely, brutally beaten, pistol-whipped, tortured, his body mutilated. He was shot in the head, and a 75-pound cotton gin fan was tied around his neck with barbed wire, and his body thrown in the Tallahatchie River, where it washed up 3 days later. The two white men were arrested and charged with murder and kidnapping, and Emmett Till's body was shipped back to Chicago, where his mother received it in horror. She collapsed at the train station. She demanded to see her son, and when she saw his mutilated, deformed body, she insisted on an open casket funeral because, she said, I want the whole world to see what they did to my boy. She invited a photographer from Jet Magazine, a leading African-American publication, to come and photograph her son, and that picture was published in Jet Magazine and in the Chicago Defender. And that picture was a defining moment for many at the beginning of the civil rights movement. The shock of his death was compounded by the brutality of his death. The horror of that picture galvanized an entire generation of black Americans and sent shock waves around the world, generating intense public reaction. For many people, the death of Emmett Till was the proverbial shot heard round the world that galvanized an entire generation to come to action that began the modern civil rights movement. 50,000 people filed past his open casket. Millions more saw that picture in publications. The press everywhere was covering the trial of these two men in Mississippi for the death of this 14-year-old boy who had died so tragically, horrifically, and brutally. In Mississippi, an all-white jury was chosen, and over 5 very hot days that September, they were presented with evidence. The star witness was 64-year-old African-American Mose Wright, Emmett Till's great-uncle, who, in surely what was one of the bravest acts in American history, stood up in open court in Mississippi and accused these two white men of murder. He pointed his finger at them and accused them of murder in open court. None of it mattered. When the defense wrapped up the case, and by the way, the main defense argument in this case was that the body fished from the river could not conclusively be proven to be Emmett Till, and so therefore there was no body, there was no murder. These men claimed that they did kidnap him, but they let him go later that night. Where he was, no one knew, they said. The defense attorneys, in their concluding statements to the jury, said, "I'm sure every last Anglo-Saxon one of you will have the courage to release these men." Faced with either acquittal or life in prison or the death penalty, the jurors later said they couldn't imagine sending a white man away for the rest of his life, or God forbid, giving him the death penalty for simply killing a black kid. They deliberated for 1 hour before they found these men not guilty, and as one juror later said, it wouldn't have taken us that long if we hadn't stopped to drink a bottle of pop. The whole world was outraged over this travesty of justice. There was no federal civil rights law then. They couldn't be tried again. There was no double jeopardy. So not being able to be tried again in state court, Milam and Bryant sold their stories to reporter William Bradford Huey in Look magazine for $4,000, and they told the reporter everything. They confessed to murder, they confessed to kidnapping, they confessed to brutally beating and shooting 14-year-old Emmett Till. It was, as I said, the shot heard round the world as concerns the civil rights movement. It sparked a movement which still reverberates. Just a few months later, in Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man on a segregated city bus. In part, she said later, because I thought about Emmett Till, and I simply couldn't go back. No one was ever brought to justice for the murder of Emmett Till, and in 2004, the Justice Department reopened the case with hopes of finding new evidence and bringing someone to justice. The two white men by that time were dead, but others, reputed to still be involved, were alive. Among other things, they exhumed the body of Emmett Till in 2005, 50 years after his death, and performed an autopsy which had never been performed and proved conclusively that the body was, in fact, Emmett Till's. He was placed into a new casket, and his old one is now on display at the National Museum of African American History and Culture at the Smithsonian. In 2006, the Emmett Till Memorial Commission was formed in Mississippi, and they have marked over 50 sites memorializing Emmett Till's life and death in the Mississippi Delta. Emmett Till's mother, Mamie Till, died in 2003 at the age of 81, having spent the remainder of her life bearing witness to her son's life and the brutality of his death and its larger meaning in American history and culture and society. The brave act of opening up his casket for many was a defining moment in American history, and Time magazine said at that time about that photograph, quote, "For almost a century, African Americans were lynched with regularity and impunity. Now, thanks to a mother's determination to expose the barbarousness of the crime, the public could no longer pretend to ignore what they couldn't see." A 14-year-old boy murdered 65 years ago this week. It sparked a revolution that still echoes and re-echoes in our society, as we can no longer pretend to ignore what we cannot see. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, Thank you for watching.